Everyone for joining us this afternoon for this very important discussion on HIV and the criminalisation of LGBT+. We have an extremely good panel for our discussion, and therefore we're not going to waste time ahead of that, but we're just going to press ahead and allow the panelists to speak. I'm going to ask them three questions which will form the first sort of two-thirds of the event, and then the final third will be an opportunity for you to ask questions of the panelists. Member of the Parliament here in the United Kingdom and a Vice Chair of the APPG on HIV and AIDS. And I'd just like to begin then by introducing our panel. Firstly, we have Joel Simpson. Joel is the Managing Director of Guyana's Society Against Sexual Orientation Discrimination, and he's joining us from Georgetown. Then I have Simran Shaikh, who is the co-founder of Rajmala Welfare Society and Director Transgender Health at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. We have Jessie Sperling, who is the Deputy Director of the Kaleidoscope Trust. We have Hye-Jin Kim, who is the Regional Key Populations Programme Officer, AIDS and Rights Alliance for Southern Africa. And then we have Sashi Fitzpatrick, who is an Advocacy Manager at Stop AIDS. And the first question that I'm going to put to the panel is, what are the barriers that LGBT plus people face in accessing HIV services? And I'm going to start that question perhaps with you, Simran.
So thank you so much, David. Barriers and challenges, and especially from the Indian context that I speak, and it would be relevant towards the global perspective also. We have heard, we have seen, and we have discussed a lot. The challenges are nothing less. It has not gone down. The curve hasn't come down. And the curve completely goes on, and it's increasing day by day. The only reason that I say this sentence before actually I jump into the challenges is because two perspectives. One, within the community, we have now started feeling that just because we are LGBTQIA individuals, this will happen, and this has to happen. After so many years of movement, after so many years of liberation, aggression, advocacy, we don't see any change in the global scenario. And when we don't see that change scenario, it directly impacts towards the individual countries. And that's where I am coming from, that LGBT, while we face challenges within the health sector, of course it is HIV remains the topmost challenge that we face. And we face because we are a bit different. We face because our preferences are different. We face because we look different. We face because we are speaking differently. And just because that difference is there, there is a stigma attached to it, there is a challenge attached to it, there's a discrimination attached to it. And on the second hand, if I see within the community perspective, that we have now imbibed it in us, imbibed it in such a way that in India, the HIV scenario came 35 years prior. We are in the country of having this HIV epidemic since 35 years. And though we have the legislative part being changed, we have laws which are favorable to the LGBTQI community, we have transgender people who have been recognized in India, yet there is challenges being faced by the community. And the challenges is of acceptance, understanding, and basically the urge of acceptance of humanity is somewhere that we need to focus more. And that's where I would, put the light today on this table that, the acceptance, the desiration of what you want to be is still lagging, and that's the biggest challenge. What I feel.
I didn't unmute myself there. Jesse, your thoughts?
Sure. So I am speaking from Kaleidoscope Trust in London. We host a secretariat to the Commonwealth Equality Network, a group of 66 organizations across 48 Commonwealth member states. I'm very glad to see two of my fellow TSEN members, Joel and Simran, here today. So I'll speak from a bit of a broader perspective in terms of what we've been seeing over the last year, especially as the COVID pandemic has struck and what this has meant for LGBTI communities. So, the exclusion of LGBTI people is driven by underlying factors like criminalization and social stigma. And this has disproportionately intensified the impact of this particular health crisis on the LGBTI plus community. So in the case of COVID, what we've seen, what our membership has reported back to us, this has led to heightened risks of isolation, violence, vulnerability to abuse, both at home, but also publicly, including at the hands of of authorities, I should say. Sort of the real manifestations of discrimination, and this also includes inequitable access to healthcare and medicines. So what we're seeing now is, such a monumental health crisis is being added on top of another ongoing and even chronic health crisis, like the HIV pandemic, and this is leading to a double health burden essentially on people who are living with HIV. So stigma, discrimination that were pre-existing are intensified through crises like these and impact vulnerable communities like LGBTI people, like key populations living with HIV. And it can happen and manifest at a variety of levels, from the interpersonal, from health workers or family members, to the meso level, such as in your community, religious community if you're part of one, to the macro, including governmental institutions and health services. And I think it's notable that both the actual experience and the fear of experiencing discrimination can lead to reluctance by LGBTI people to visit healthcare providers. And this really hinders the proper screening, early diagnosis, and treatment for health conditions like HIV, which once more increases the health inequalities faced by LGBTI individuals. And with some of the particular barriers that COVID has specifically has posed, these create considerable threats across the HIV treatment cycle. Since HIV testing motivation and access to care has been reduced by policies put in place to deal with the COVID outbreak. So stay-at-home orders, physical distancing directives, travel restrictions, and the perceived risk of transmission. These barriers, I think, are especially critical for people living with HIV, for LGBTI individuals, given the elevated risks they face, the higher representation in key populations that I'm sure some of my colleagues on the panel will discuss in more detail, leading to worsening health outcomes and probably greater risk for HIV infection. So, when we take these factors into consideration within the wider medical landscape, which has faced a supply shortages and interruptions of services, including to HIV medications, as a result of the pandemic, we do realize that LGBTI people are facing a very dire situation. Thanks.
Asian, can I come to you?
Yes. First, I want to highlight something very specific, and I hope you're all aware about what's happening in Uganda. Parliament has passed a new sexual offences bill that criminalizes same-sex sexuality completely, homosexuality completely. It also has severe issues about consent. It says, for example, that consent cannot be withdrawn after sex is initiated. It has yet to be signed into law by President Museveni, but it is passed by Parliament. And I just want to highlight that because that is one example where I want to say is that we cannot look at LGBTI, criminalization of the LGBTI community in isolation of criminalization, as well as other issues of sexuality broader, whether it affects women, whether it affects issues of abortion, whether it intersects any issues of body autonomy and integrity. To me, also, I want to stress that the LGBTI community is not one community. It is trans people, it is intersex people, it is lesbians, gay men, lesbian women deal with different impacts that might not be as HIV related, but definitely have an impact on their health in general. While with trans people, they are often not directly criminalized within laws, but they are facing indirect criminalization through laws on sex work. Then you have laws of people who use criminalization of drug use, which also impacts the LGBTI community because intersectionality is a thing, and it's important to acknowledge that. What I also want to state is that from my point of view, criminalization of the LGBTI community, whether directly or indirectly, constitutes one clear thing. It is the denial, it is denying people the right to exist. And as strong a statement as that is, I truly believe that. It's denying people the right to bodily autonomy and integrity. It is saying to someone, you do not have the right to decide or to own or have integrity about your body. We are denying you the right to be who you are. We're denying you the right to exist. And automatically that has broad social, economic, and health-related implications, both physical health, mental health, both in terms of access to jobs, and all of these things lead to a variety of issues. HIV is one of the most visible ways in which this happens. Criminalization provides a legal basis for ongoing stigma and discrimination from health facilities. Furthermore, it provides a basis of essentially not just criminalizing people who, due to economic circumstances, because they are criminalized, engage in sex work, but the added criminalization of sex work leads to further increasing vulnerability. And so the intersection of different forms of criminalization further impacts certain members of the LGBTI community to HIV, as well as to access to service even more. And then I don't want to necessarily reiterate what some of the other speakers have said, but definitely health-seeking behavior, as well as self-stigma, but also the simple impunity of violence. The Uganda has clauses, like there are clauses in certain criminalization laws that keep popping up that says that people are obliged to report other people, where having HIV is seen as an aggravating factor in sentencing when somebody has been, arrested for same-sex behavior. We are seeing a sheer denial of people's humanity, and that denial fuels the pandemic in ways that we need to be very conscious of. Secondly, there are places in Southern Africa where HIV services are being provided by civil society. And that is great because government doesn't really want to do anything about. However, criminalization is a huge barrier to our sustainability. And we're seeing a huge shift globally of countries in the quote-unquote global north restricting funding, being less funding available, people focusing on domestic resource mobilization, saying countries should start doing this. But if your country is criminalizing LGBTI people, we cannot trust those countries to provide services to gay men, to trans people. So I think within the context of this discussion, it's important to acknowledge the dynamics, even the lasting effects of colonization, and acknowledging that these laws are not African. They came with the British Empire. It's like acknowledging moving forward that there's a certain responsibility to understand these dynamics when funding gets withdrawn and countries deeply homophobic and CSOs are having trouble continuing these services. Decriminalization provides a huge barrier to our sustainability. Whatever we have made huge gains in certain countries in Southern Africa. Look at, for example, Swaziland, look at other places like I think before the criminalization, Uganda even, but now sustainability becomes a problem if resources are not becoming available and if criminalization persists, and criminalization is a huge part of that. So that's where I want to put my opening forward.
Okay, thank you very much. A lot to think about there. Joe, can we come to you next?
Sure. I agree with a lot of what my colleagues said, but I'm just going to put a lot of that into a Guyanese and Caribbean perspective, because I think it's quite similar experiences across the Commonwealth, as my colleague Jesse shared from the TCEN network, of which SASA Guyana is a member. In a nutshell, I think stigma discrimination is what impedes access to services for our communities. And that's a huge and a broad term that I use to really refer to the ways that forms of prejudice operate against LGBTQ people in Guyana and the Caribbean. Homophobia, transphobia at a socio-cultural level manifests itself in everyday ways where people can't even access public transportation in Guyana, especially trans people. That's one of the everyday barriers that they face to move from point A to point B. A lot of this is driven by laws and policies itself. We still have in Guyana laws which criminalize same-sex intimacy between men in the form of 3 offences under our Criminal Law Offences Act, which we inherited through British colonialism. And those offences are referred to as buggery, attempted buggery, and gross indecency. And the sentences range from 2 years to life imprisonment. Also on our books, we have policies which don't allow men who have sex with men, women who have sex with women to donate blood, regardless of last sexual contact. It makes no assessment for risk and exposure. There's just a blanket ban on those groups, even women who have sex with women, which is not considered to be a quote-unquote high-risk group for HIV. So we can see that in the laws and the policies itself, queerphobia is very much an inherent problem, and I think it drives a lot of the sociocultural discrimination that we see and face in terms of just being able to do basic things like access public transportation, to be able to go to the clinics for an HIV test or HIV treatment. In the context of COVID-19, the pandemic has only exacerbated these inequalities. Along with groups in Barbados, St. Lucia, and Grenada, in mid 2020, we conducted a study to look at the impact that COVID-19 was having on LGBT communities in the 4 countries. What we found for Guyana is that over 70% of the LGBTQ population here had either lost their jobs, their businesses had been closed down, or they had significant loss of income because of the pandemic. A lot of our communities in this part of the world work in the informal sector, and the stay-at-home and lockdown and other kind of containment orders, which were very necessary at the time for reducing the spread of COVID-19, had a huge impact on livelihoods. So people are still at a very basic level where money is short for food and water and cleaning supplies and personal and protective equipment. And people don't have money for transportation to even go to the clinics to access services. So from a socioeconomic perspective, the pandemic has worsened or exacerbated the existing inequalities which are present in the laws, in the policies, and in the attitudes of the populations towards LGBTQ people in Guyana and the Caribbean.
Thank you. And finally, I'll come to you, Sashi.
Yes, thank you, David. Yeah, I think my colleagues have, made the arguments really eloquently. I guess just something to add is, as a network of organisations who are working on the HIV response, we've heard that, having accurate data about LGBTQI+ populations is you know, that is so vital for program and service delivery, and obviously like criminalisation and social stigma and self-stigma, you know, that makes collecting data very difficult. And yeah, just kind of building on what Jessie was saying, you know, in terms of like where the HIV response was at before COVID, and how we knew that, you know, we were still way off the target of, you know, ending AIDS as a public health threat by 2030, and that, you know, testing has now fallen by over 40% last year as a result of the pandemic, and that, you know, new HIV transmissions are, you know, being increasingly concentrated in the most marginalised groups, including the LGBTQI community. And, you know, as Hijan was saying, with that, we've now got this step back in the UK from commitments to funding that crucial delivery of service, which is led by, you know, LGBTQI organisations, who are the best placed organisations to design, you know, implement and evaluate those services. I think we're going to come on maybe to the funding question a little bit later on, so I don't want to preempt the next question. But yeah, I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for, you know, very comprehensive and thought-provoking answers to the first of our questions. The second question is, what roles do civil society and community groups have in addressing these issues? And perhaps, Jessie, I could start with you this time.
Sure. So, I mean, we know that people living with HIV, you know, especially those from who face multiple marginalizations and are parts of other marginalized populations, are more likely to access treatment and continue treatment if they're surrounded by a strong support system. And, you know, access is also more likely if individuals see themselves represented in the institutional systems that provide these services. So, I mean, this is why, you know, ensuring that community groups and services, support systems that directly provide support to people who are living with HIV, including LGBTI plus people, are protected and ideally strengthened, so they can provide that safe harbor for individuals navigating, you know, through a very difficult health situation, which, you know, as we discussed, you know, is further you know, compounded by the fact that we are in a post-COVID situation now, and a global pandemic. You know, we can also, you know, civil society can also lend our support and advice to help medical organizations deliver innovative strategies to counter challenges in HIV prevention and care, you know, including multi-month dispensing of antiretrovirals, which has happened in a couple of different country contexts as a result of the physical distancing and the limitations on movements, online clinics, so things shift virtually, again, as a result. You know, of course, there's a prerequisite for IT that works and is accessible, but you know, that's another option, for example. And, you know, building other support networks or signposting, you know, for treatment. And then lastly, civil society can also you know, help develop and even co-produce training programs for health workers on avoiding discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression or sex characteristics when providing care. And, you know, we play an important role in working with policymakers and decision makers, and this is sort of the advocacy work that we do, you know, to try to shape public policy around this and respond so that it responds appropriately to the needs on the ground.
Thank you. Joe, perhaps I can come to you next on this question.
Sure. I want to talk about three things that we do as part of our response, and they actually fit quite neatly into SASO's three programs, which are our human rights, homophobia's education, and our human services program. I will start with the human services program. It's become necessary for civil society groups and community organizations to really fill the gaps in service provision, like Jessie is saying. Because of the criminalization and exclusion, our populations don't go to access government services very easily. I feel like this situation has improved in the last 10 years or so because of heavy investments in training and sensitization, you know, with support from donors, international donors like the Global Fund and PEPFAR. But there's still a far more way to go and a lot more work to be done. And I think we need to sustain those investments, or we risk reversing those gains if we don't continue to invest in the successes that we already have. So Over the years, SAS again has been providing HIV testing and counseling services. And right now, one of our most recent services, which is our most popular service, has been mental health counseling, even before the pandemic. And because of the homophobias that people face in their lives, family rejection, issues at schools, workplaces, and so on, the mental health toll on LGBTQ people is significant. And we found during our research last year in the pandemic that the COVID-19 and everything to deal with COVID-19, having to stay at home with homophobic family members and all of that, which drives family violence, all of that was compounding the mental health burdens that LGBTQ people, especially youth, face even before the pandemic. So we have to fill those gaps with those services, because even when they exist at the governmental level, there isn't equal access for our communities. The second seminal thing that we do to address this issue, and Jesse also mentioned it, is we're heavily invested in training and sensitize stakeholders, especially governmental stakeholders who have a duty to provide services to the population. So we have a program that we call our Gender and Sexual Diversity Education Initiative, where we do extensive training with healthcare workers, police officers, faith leaders, community groups, private sector, and the list goes on about sexual and gender diversity. And we find that that training, some of it has gone online and into smaller components since COVID-19. That training can really be transformative, because a huge part of the problem around homophobia, around queerphobia is ignorance. And having the opportunity to share knowledge, and also having the opportunity to bring LGBTQ people to interact with these stakeholders so that they can ask questions in a respectful manner, really does have a great impact. And the third and final thing I'd mention very quickly is strategic litigation. And in the face of governments not fulfilling their responsibilities to change these laws, which criminalize LGBTQ communities, we have had to go to the courts. We've done a lot of advocacy with the executive and the parliamentary level, but we've had to go to the courts to get these laws, which are just very struck down. And we had the last law which criminalized cross-dressing in the Western Hemisphere. And it took us over 8 years in court. We went all the way to the Caribbean Court of Justice, which is our final court, and it's based in Trinidad, to get a successful judgment which struck down the law against cross-dressing and declared it completely unconstitutional. So it's no longer part of our law books. So in the face of government inaction and parliamentary inertia, we've also had to use the judicial system to deal with some of the structural issues like these unjust laws.
Well, excellent in your success in that regard. Sashi, can I come to you next?
Yes. Yeah, I guess I just want to say, like, from an HIV perspective, you know, we've always known that the community and civil society led response has been effective, you know, and from the things that Joel and Jesse just spoke about in terms of like peer support and, you know, the design of services, the implementation, the review of them, and all the advocacy around, you know, challenging punitive laws. And it's always been done on such a limited budget. You know, programs targeting key populations received, I think, only 2% of all kind of HIV funding, even though, you know, within key population groups, that accounts for over half of all new infections. That's like based on the 2018 statistics. It's been great that, you know, the UNAIDS strategy has come out really strongly on positioning, you know, communities and community-led HIV services at the heart of the response. But yeah, as you know, as Hijam was saying before, like the sustainability is a real issue. And you know, we've just heard that the UK are going to be cutting their aid budget by a third, and you know, for UNAIDS, that's a cut of 80%. Down to just 2 million a year, and UNAIDS, you know, are supportive in many different ways through like what they do in terms of how they support, you know, global funding and be the kind of like on the ground kind of support for many organisations in in running services that are being funded through Global Fund money. We also know that there's been this really effective rapid response fund from one of our members, Frontline AIDS. It's a fund that provides emergency support for people and organisations that are facing urgent barriers to accessing HIV prevention, treatment and support services due to new criminalising laws or cases of violence or discrimination, human rights violations. And it's been really effective. Since 2016, I think over 500 grants have been issued to civil society-based organisations led by LGBTI plus people and sex workers and people who use drugs. And I think they get on average like 13 requests every week. But yeah, this program is at risk now. I don't think it's going to be refunded because of the AIDS cuts. And they also instigated a new similar project, the Zero Violence program, which also kind of does other bits of research as well. It looks like even though the FCDO recently invested in that in the UK, it doesn't look like any kind of further funding will be likely. So it's a really terrible situation in terms of funding, especially from the UK government, and that was in light of it already being a precarious funding situation.
Yeah, well, I'm certainly going to take up the UN AIDS funding issue. I spoke with them yesterday on that matter. Can we come, Hajin, to you next?
I want to make just a few, it's like just to build on what the previous panelists have said. It's like it's not just about ensuring sustainability of funding and trying to, in a situation where ODA is being cut, to ensure that that we somehow deal with it, the sustainability issues, but also ensuring that the resources go to the right organizations. And in this level, community-based organizations are ideally placed to ensure services, especially in a case where government is not providing them, but also in a case where government is providing them, community knows best. I mean, we have been shouting nothing about us without us, meaning involvement, etc., for a long time. But we still see cases where funding by overseas development agencies or bilaterals, Global Fund, for example, is given to organizations who have no connection to the community. And they make huge millions out of it, and the services are not suitable. So it's not just that. We need to ensure that community organizations are the one at the forefront, but are also supported in their labor and respected that they put in the labor, often being able to be far more cost effective than huge international or regional organizations to do this kind of work within the community. The second thing that I think is necessary to highlight is that when working towards decriminalization of any kind, community organizations play a key role. Because what we see is that work in order to change attitudes needs to go hand in hand with decriminalization efforts or changes in any policy. In order to garner, if you go the political angle, parliament, legislative angle, parliamentarians, it's like they need to see popular support. And the only way to do that is to start looking at the local leaders, religious leaders, having people speak up. You need to change attitudes. If you go the judicial angle, we need to think about potential backlash if things don't go well. We need to protect our community, etc. And also, when we think about if we don't do it properly, one thing that you see in South Africa as a case example, for example, South Africa has decriminalized everything. However, the amount of violence in this country is extreme. Decriminalization does not end violence. Decriminalization does not automatically, magically provide solutions to the crisis, including HIV. It needs to come hand in hand with a concerted effort that acknowledges community-based organizations and the community in the processes leading up to decriminalization, in the processes after. It is not an end goal decriminalization. It's one step in a certain direction. And it's one step that comes with multitude of steps. Changes in policies are often more low-hanging fruit that you can reach towards. For example, in some countries, despite the fact that same-sex practices might be criminalized, you see still other government agencies trying to at least do something or putting it in the national strategic plan to combat HIV. Well, those are small steps, but the community needs to be involved in each step. Otherwise, these interventions will remain ineffective, but also to ensure that decriminalization or progressive policies will have the desired impact in order to benefit the community needs to be involved, not just involved, but supported. The amount of times when I see community activists exhausted and burned out from sitting at meetings and meetings and meetings and doing all the work without proper compensation for their organizations is extreme. And I think this is something that we rarely talk about, but we need to start addressing. Where also you see consultants from Europe and the US coming in, raking in millions of rands, I don't know what that is in pounds, while local activists are surviving on minimal salaries and are getting burned out. For me, there are a lot of questions to be asked, but I think in terms of resources and in terms of the fight for decriminalization, in terms of providing HIV service, the entire holistic package, we really need to look after community-based activists and organizations and foster the internal capacity, right? It is not sustainable to rely on international experts. They are too expensive. International organizations, when people in Geneva are getting paid, when people in other countries are getting paid huge amount of money to come into a country to implement services, those services will then either not cater to the community properly, or they will end up having to outsource it to a local community who will get even less money because cuts are taken, and it is not sustainable. And it becomes not cost effective. So these are sort of things that I want to sort of contribute and building upon what the previous panelists have said.
I think those are really excellent points. I think that is a really, really important issue. The balance between that's given to community activists compared to external consultants and the support, the respective support that they have. So thank you for making that point. Simran, can I come to you finally in this section?
Sure. I think my colleagues and esteemed speakers have appropriately put up the cases as far as the civil society and the networks are concerned. What is the significant role of them? I just wanted to put up my perspective in four manners. I think it is really, really very, very important for having networks and civil societies and to be having an exclusive civil societies of LGBTQI people. So one of the best case studies which I can really talk about from India is we have four perspectives towards the significance of civil societies and networks. One, of course, as he did mention right now, is about ensuring community voices and community concerns are heard, which is absolutely very important. But at the same time, it's also important that the community are actually sitting at the implementation design, like what he said right now. We in India have technical resource groups within the nodal government agencies where our community members are present as technical assistants to the government, technical assistants to the donors, because India is such a mini continent, and India is not a small country. India is a huge country, and I call it as a mini continent. And when we look at 3,000 different languages and different cultures, it's really next to impossible even for the government to really implement such kind of vast interventions. And at that moment, government gets the support from the civil society organizations and the networks. The second emphasizes what we do is build on the education part, where we talk about the new preventions, the new innovations that have come to the market. For Western countries, and I'm sorry, for Western countries, we have pre-exposure prophylaxis and post-exposure prophylaxis actually being implemented. But it's sad, in in this certain region, we are yet to even formalize the guidelines, and the guidelines have to be adapted. And that's where the civil society really pushes. So, building on the education, learning perspectives, that is the cross learnings from the innovative, developed countries to the developing countries and underdeveloping countries, as per the norms of the funders are concerned. This is how we sort of, cross learn, and getting associated and having building within the countries, the networks really helps to sort of get those information far away, actually to the grassroots level. Last but not least, we also believe that having networks and civil society is like from within, it's a safe space for us, where we can talk about legislative part, where we can talk about any issue that is really disturbing and hurting at the grassroots level. Right now, we all know that pandemic in India especially has the second wave going on. The entire country is completely under lockdown. And that's where these kind of networks, civil society organizations do help us in sort of, having the topmost information actually reaching to a person who is literate, semi-literate, and completely illiterate. So these are my interventions that I wanted to put into it. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that. The final of our three questions is, what can the UK government and indeed parliamentarians like me in the UK do to help on the decriminalisation of LGBT plus and HIV? And perhaps, Joel, we could start with you on this occasion.
Well, I think the seminal thing that could be done would be to really invest into the work that is being done at the local level by community organizations themselves. And on this call, we've heard of a couple of examples already that exist. The Rapid Response Fund, of which SASOD is a multi-time beneficiary from Frontline AIDS, has provided us with groundbreaking resources to do work that we would otherwise not have the opportunity to do, including 1 year an assessment of what our populations know about PrEP and the demand for PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis for HIV in our country. Kaleidoscope Trust just finished a program at the end of the first quarter of this year, which was funded by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, where TCEN member organizations receive grants to do advocacy work in the context of COVID-19. And I know at one point the embassies had a mechanism for issuing small grants to LGBTQ organizations. And in our early days at SASOD, our film festivals were supported, or LGBTQ film festivals before we had a Pride Parade and a big Pride Festival and all of that, were supported by the British High Commission in Vienna and Georgetown. In the context of COVID-19, there seems to have been a shift and a decline on focusing funding on HIV and human rights. And I think we risk losing all that we've invested in over the last 2 decades or more to get us to the place where we've at if we don't sustain those investments. I think governmental mechanisms for dealing with these issues can be costly, and we need to prioritize our investments. I was appalled when my colleague from Stop AIDS shared that statistic about only 2% of funding going to key population organizations, when we always talk about the epidemic being focused among key populations, especially in countries like Guyana. And then we're saying that we're not receiving proportionally the amount of funding that is needed for that. So I think there needs to be a repositioning, a redirection of how funding is going, and not just cutting funding across the board, but really trying our best to get the money to the community organizations that are really doing the meaningful work on the ground that is going to bring about and sustain the changes that Hijen spoke about.
That was a very good answer, Joe, because it also, I think, answered a question on the chat from Harriet, which was partly directed to you and my interpretation of what you've just said is that you, if you have a look at that question in the chat, that you've broadly answered that question. But you referenced kaleidoscopes, so I'll go next to Jesse, if I may.
Sure. So, the question, I guess, is what the UK government can do. And I think, first and foremost, I think the UK needs to keep this issue on the global agenda and use its systems and platforms, which are vast and far-reaching, to amplify and represent the lived experiences of people living with HIV. Other panelists have already mentioned this, Hejin, Joel, Simran, but more dialogue and partnership between activists, LGBTI organizations, and governments is really important. I think parliamentarians have a responsibility to address this legacy that LGBTI people face, people living with HIV face, others, of the British colonial period, that manifests as both criminalizing laws, but also the lack of protective laws and the social attitudes that those support and underpin, that really stigmatize and limit the life chances of certain marginalized groups and marginalize those groups themselves. To seek to address that, and the former Prime Minister May's statement in 2018 expressing her deep regret for those laws, I think was an important milestone in that recognition. And we need to build on that. So working more with these organizations that are doing the work, on the ground, I think would be really important for parliamentarians, especially, to increase their own understanding, and this includes, consultations with sort of how to go about, creating change and supporting, and this is sort of a broad recommendation, but the intersection between health and stigma and society that HIV represents and what it means for LGBTI people, I think, requires a more holistic approach. And just sort of on the shifts in funding that the panelists have mentioned, we are absolutely seeing, a reduction in overseas development aid, which is having a disproportionate impact on groups that are disproportionately impacted, by criminalization, by stigma, and everything that we've discussed before, and a shift away from the human rights and HIV work, sort of to other areas. And so we can't lose sight of sort of the importance of this, especially as the UK, in its integrated review, has established human rights and those of LGBTI people as an area of import and priority. So maintaining the pressure on the executive to ensure that the excellent work that is ongoing, that has been built up, and that the vast amount of work and support for the organizations, for the activists doing the work on the ground, doesn't suffer as a result.
Thank you very much. Simran, can I come to you next?
Sure. So I think if I speak from the context of India, I think India has sort of decriminalized the laws which actually criminalize homosexuality and the LGBT. But it is just from the books of law. From here, from this level, it is yet to go. And that's our complete struggle what we are having. As a request, humble request to the UK parliamentarians, the member of parliaments, what I could make is, the essentialness of continuing advocacy with HIV, because now HIV has gone, and yet there is a lot of advocacy that needs to be done. So we request, if possible, resources. If not possible resources, at least having a word with the country governments, where people are sort of criminalized, or where people are not sort of criminalized, at least to ensure that the government, having a dialogue with the government, has a larger impact than a citizen having a sort of a dialogue with the government. This is what I think, that if UK could be a sort of LGBTQ voices towards the specific issues of advocacy and HIV to the country government, that would be something great.
Thank you very much. Sorry, Sushi, could I come to you next, please?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to build on what Joel and Hijam were saying around, making sure that financing gets to the right organizations. And it's been promising that the International Development Select Committee, who are the body that, monitor the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office, have launched this kind of group of inquiries into the culture and philosophy of aid, which is really asking, about the colonial roots of aid and the contemporary manifestations of that as well. And we've been inputting into those, as have many of our colleagues. And one of the pieces of evidence that we were drawing on was a study from the Overseas Development Institute, which was looking at how overseas development assistance tends to go to these big, international NGOs. They really dominate the kind of humanitarian landscape, as they're kind of perceived to have, systems and capacity to absorb like fluctuating, dynamics and risks. But it means that basically they become the gatekeeper for funding. And it crowds the space and means that as a result, there's not, enough funding for community and society-based organizations that would be better placed actually to lead on the design and implementation and evaluation of, services that are delivering for their own community. So it's a real issue that we're really interested in exploring how you could create funding which is much more flexible and is based on these much, more kind of deeper trusting and longer term relationships, that, we're kind of abandoning this sort of paternalistic demonization of LGBTI groups and sex workers and people who use drugs and other marginalized groups, and actually trying to do this through trust, understanding needs, understanding that money needs to be spent flexibly in order for those organizations to be effective. So I think that's one thing that the UK government can do, but this is in the context of them having cut bilateral aid, and we've seen the impact on that on many of our members and organizations that they work with. So yeah, the kind of increase in getting funding to the right organizations and the right kind of funding, so that it's flexible, it doesn't have these really onerous kind of reporting mechanisms attached to them, that it's really kind of there, like the frontline aids one, that can be like quickly given out, and that has proved really effective. So yeah, we would definitely advocate for an increase of funding and an increase in the flexibility of funding for those organizations that are best placed to lead and design and evaluate the services that are impacting their communities.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And Hijin, could I ask you to contribute now?
Okay, so I don't want to reiterate what has been said. So obviously continue for local organizations, but I want to emphasize that this needs to be long-term and sustained support. There's been examples, for example, where politically suddenly priorities for organizations in certain countries, and suddenly organizations on the ground find them without funding, because suddenly they say, rather than LGBTI, we want to fund X, Y, and Z issue. And so it dances around with, so to a certain extent, some organizations within the African continent are sort of at the whim of political developments in Europe, which is problematic. And I think short-term funding does not promote sustainability. The second thing I want to say is that, and I want to bring a specific example, in 2018, the Swedish, in response to the United States global gag rule reinstatement by, well, we know by who, decided to cut all funding, or say it's like you can't get funding if you're getting funding from if you sign a global gag rule. Such things are not helpful. Similarly, when Uganda first put forward anti-homosexuality bill, I think it was in 2009, 2010, certain countries were like, we need to impose sanctions. And local LGBT activists say this is not helpful. This is prescriptive. We need to ask the question, we need to ensure that ODA does not turn into a situation where countries that have previously have been prescribed how they should run their country through colonialism are now feeling that they're being prescribed again. Community voices and community activists are the key to ensure that work is done in a way that is sustainable for each local context. Because we know what happens. We know that the homosexuality is Western, homosexuality is a Western import. It is an argument that so often is used. When overseas governments become very prescriptive in how things should happen in a country, in kind of disregard of local organizations, it only does more damage. So local organizations, or asking local organizations to follow specific strategies. So I want to emphasize is that's one of the reasons why we look at it, right? The second thing I think where the UK can really, or any government really that in Europe or North America can really step up is the fact is that do advocacy, do outreach to your colleagues in other countries. If UK can engage with countries in, well, Europe, I don't want to bring political issues into it, but even with the US, etc., the US is less likely to listen to South Africa or Uganda than it is to the UK. We live in a world where, it's like UK can take a position and engage with other governments in the global north in pushing for exactly what we're saying, in trying to sort of hold peer governments to account and not just focus on governments in the global south. I do believe that is something where the UK can step up. And the third thing is that we all need to acknowledge that, and COVID has proven this, is public health is not a local issue, and it can never, ever be seen as a local issue anymore. We have evidence of this now. What happens in the country halfway across the world will have an impact in UK, in South Africa, in India, in all other countries, and it's unavoidable. Investing in public health in general, including HIV, is to a global benefit.
Okay, well, thank you. And that, I think, is a very good message on which to conclude, because we're at the end of our time, and our three questions have taken up the time that was available. But I feel that was positive because everyone has something very meaningful to contribute. So I'm going to conclude by thanking our panelists and asking them just to give us one sentence to conclude the event that they would like the participants to take away from the event. So, Hei-Jin, if I can start with you, and again, thank you for your contribution this afternoon. And if you had just one sentence to convey to those who participated, what would that be?
Meaningful engagement with local community organizations must be at the center of everything, not just implementation, but design and funding decisions by, at every level. I think that is my key message.
Thank you, and a very important one. I'll come to you next, Joe. Thank you again for your participation and for your engagement there on the chat.
I would say, looking at who's on the call and that we're all engaged in some form or the other with working with the UK government, and given the focus of today's event, that we need to be invested in this advocacy beyond special days on the calendar. This is not just about IDHB or World AIDS Day or Human Rights Day, that we need to keep these conversations going so that the stakeholders who are not here among us can also understand the need for these investments that we're making the case for. Often we're preaching to the choir when we're in the room of 20 friends or so. And a lot of the people who have the power to make these decisions and make the changes that we want to see made are not part of the conversation. So I want us to be invested in that engagement and that advocacy beyond IDHB.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you again. And thank you again for your participation today. Sashi, can I come to you next, please?
Yeah, I'd say that we really want to build on this kind of initial momentum around the UK government acknowledging the colonial history of international development and how that implicates how development is designed and how funding is designed today, and to work to realize that the community and civil society organizations that are at the center of the HIV response, and have done so much amazing work with so little resources, need more flexible investment to be able to continue their vital work.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Sashi, for your participation this afternoon. Jesse, can I come to you next?
Yes, sure. I guess my last point would be, the UK is in a global leadership position, especially from across the board, but especially from an LGBTI perspective this year as the co-chair of the Equal Rights Coalition, and it has an opportunity and responsibility to help connect the dots, through everything that's going on in terms of HIV response, in terms of supporting the human rights of LGBTI people. Connect those dots globally with other states that are part of this body, but also ensuring that there is consistency and connecting the dots, sort of what's happening domestically in the UK, and that position as a champion for human rights. And one thing it can absolutely do is, this sort of through the comprehensive spend review, ensure the sustainable resourcing for community organizations.
Well, thank you, Jesse, again for your participation, and particularly thank you for everything that Kaleidoscope does. It's really, really important. And Simran, we began with you, so I think there's a symmetry if we could conclude with you.
Definitely. So my concluding remark would be, let's emphasize and ensure community is at the driving seat.
Yes. Excellent. Well, thank you very much indeed for that. Thank you. Thank our speakers. Thank you to our participants. Thank you to Mark and Anna from the APPGs who've helped us pull this afternoon together. I think it's been a really informative